You know, some peoples just have a legendary reputation. The Franks are one of them. Their kings were supposedly descended from sea monsters, and their warriors wielded terrifying throwing axes. They started out as one of Rome's biggest headaches, but their descendants, well, they would one day rule over a new Roman Empire in the West. This is the story of how Rome's deadliest enemies ended up becoming its heirs.
So that's the big question, right? How does a so-called barbarian people go from being raiders on the frontier to basically running the show? And the story isn't a simple one of conquest. Oh no, it's a long, complicated, and deeply intertwined relationship that totally changes how we think about the fall of Rome.
All right, let's set the scene. We're in the 3rd century, and the Roman Empire stretched to its absolute breaking point. And right there, along its northern frontier, the Rhine River, new groups of warriors are starting to make a real name for themselves.
This whole era is famously known as the crisis of the 3rd century. And to put it mildly, the empire was a mess. We're talking endless civil wars, economic collapse, the works. These early Frankish groups saw a golden opportunity. Starting around 256 CE, they launched raid after raid across the river. And these weren't just small border skirmishes either. Some of these warbands pushed all the way down into Spain.
Now, what's really interesting here is that the Franks weren't one single unified nation. Not at all. That name was actually a label the Romans came up with for a whole bunch of different tribes who kind of shared a language and a warrior culture. They probably called themselves something like Franca, which might have just meant the brave or the fierce.
So the Romans quickly figured out that just fighting these guys was like playing a game of whack-a-mole. For every raiding party they defeated, another one would just pop up somewhere else. It was exhausting and expensive. So they decided to change their strategy completely.
Instead of trying to just crush them all, emperors started to think, wait a minute, what if we co-opt them? The new logic was, why not turn your defeated enemies into your border guards? You settle them on Roman land, make them dependent on the empire, and then have them defend the frontier from the next group of raiders. Honestly, it was a pretty brilliant and pragmatic solution.
And this policy even had a formal legal name. The first Franks who were allowed to stay were called laeti. This gave them a very specific status. They weren't slaves, they were free men, but they weren't citizens either. They were given land, and in return, they owed the empire one thing: military service.
This all came to a head in the year 358. This is a big one. After defeating a pretty large Frankish force, the future Emperor Julian did something different. He didn't kick him out. Instead, he settled the entire group as a cohesive unit inside the empire's borders. This was really the first time a whole Frankish people was officially brought into the Roman system, lock, stock, and barrel.
And what happens when you have this much close contact, this much shared military service? Well, you get this fascinating new hybrid culture. The Franks were definitely becoming more Roman, but at the same time, they were staying very, very Frankish. You can literally see this in the ground. Archaeology tells a fantastic story here. You look at a typical Roman grave from this period, and you might find some pottery, maybe a few cheap copper coins. But an integrated Frankish soldier, totally different story. He was buried with his weapons, a huge sign of his warrior identity. But he was also buried with Roman-style pottery and coins, though he clearly preferred the fancy silver and gold ones. They were picking and choosing, adopting Roman customs, but on their own terms.
And what was the #1 symbol of that Frankish warrior identity? The one weapon that screamed Frank. It was their famous throwing axe, the Francisca.
But here's the twist, and it's a good one. Modern research is pretty sure this iconic barbarian weapon wasn't some ancient Germanic invention. It was most likely mass-produced in Roman state factories and issued to Frankish soldiers. Think about that. The Francisca wasn't a symbol of being an outsider, it was a symbol of their special elite status inside the Roman army.
And believe me, this integration went all the way to the very top. We're talking about men with Frankish names like Arbogast and Bauto becoming top-ranking generals, basically controlling the entire Western Roman army. Bauto even became consul in 385. And get this, his own daughter, Aelia Eudoxia, went on to marry the Roman Emperor Arcadius. A Frankish woman became the Empress of Rome. It's just incredible.
But nothing, and I mean nothing, captures this dual identity better than this inscription from a soldier's tombstone in the 4th century. He describes himself as a Frankish citizen and a Roman soldier. For him, there was no contradiction there. The two things had completely merged. He was both at the same time. So by the time we get to the chaotic 5th century, the Franks aren't just neighbors or hired guns. They are a fundamental, integrated part of the Roman military and political system, and that put them in the perfect position for what happened next, the total collapse of the West.
On the very last day of the year 406, waves of invaders crossed a frozen Rhine river, and the Roman frontier was just shattered. In the chaos that followed, the Franks actually acted as loyal Roman allies. They were foederati, fighting alongside the great general Aetius to defeat Attila the Hun. But then, in 454, Aetius was murdered. The emperor was killed soon after, and just like that, poof, central Roman authority in Gaul just evaporated.
So, how did the Franks take over? Well, it really wasn't a conquest in the way we usually imagine it. It was more like a promotion. For decades, they were already the military backbone of northern Gaul. They were the foederati, the official defenders of the whole region. When their bosses back in Italy disappeared, they were the only ones left with a real army and a command structure. They just kept doing their job, only now they were doing it for themselves.
Which leads us with a really provocative thought, doesn't it? The story of the Franks kind of messes with our whole idea of the fall of Rome. Was it really a violent overthrow by foreign invaders? Or was it more like a handover, where the most competent and integrated group of employees took over the family business when the old management just faded away?